conflict between the two great sections existing between the two races, the European and the African, which inhabit the southern section, and the acts of aggression and encroachment to which it has led. I am a believer in that portion of the Declaration of Independence in which it is set forth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hence, I am an abolitionist. Convince me that one man may rightfully make another man his slave, and I will no longer subscribe to the Declaration.
The United States was hardly united in the 1850s. The country had divided into two sections, northern states and southern states. This sectionalism was the result of decades of political, economic, and social differences. But the greatest, most divisive source of sectional disagreement was over slavery. The South's economy depended on an unskilled manual labor force, thus slavery was ideal. The North was a region of factory owners and workers. Skilled labor was required, and slavery seldom provided it. Also, many Northern leaders abhorred slavery for humanitarian reasons. The country was on the verge of chaos. In November 1860, 4 men ran for President of the United States. No candidate won a majority of the popular vote, but Abraham Lincoln, a moderate abolitionist and staunch opponent of secession, received a majority of the electoral votes. As a result of Lincoln's election, South Carolina left the Union and ordered outgoing President James Buchanan to evacuate the federal forts in that state. Buchanan ignored that order. Just after his inauguration, Lincoln decided to resupply the beleaguered garrison stationed at Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor. This action conflicted with South Carolina's secession order, so on April 12, 1861, Confederate militia shelled the fort. For more than 24 hours, their big guns pounded the Federals, until finally Major Robert Anderson surrendered. War had begun. By June 1861, 10 more states had seceded, with North Carolina joining them on May 20th. Together, they formed their own government, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Both countries called for troops to build armies. Men came from cities and from farms, from wealthy families and from backwoods settlements. They came educated and untaught, dressed up in fancy new uniforms, and marched off to what they thought would be a short, glorious war. The biggest worry for some was that the war would end before they had a chance to fight. The first clash of the two green armies took place in July 1861 at a little creek in Virginia. It was a short and terribly disorganized fight, but when the guns stopped, over 4,000 men were dead or wounded at the Battle of Manassas. New warfare technology made killing very efficient, and the notion of a short war began to die. The South fought to protect its new government and the state's right to secede. The North responded, intent on bringing the rebels back into the Union. For 2 years, they fought one bloody battle after another. The year 1862 saw the Battle of Shiloh, where more Americans fell than in all previous wars combined. There was the Second Battle of Manassas, worse than Shiloh, and Antietam, where in a single day over 20,000 Americans fell. It was a year of awful, horrifying carnage.
Before the sunlight faded, I walked over the narrow field. All around lay the Confederate dead, clad in butternut. As I looked down on the poor, pinched faces, all of them had died out. There was no possession in those rigid forms, nor in those fixed eyes staring into space. Clearly, it was not their war.
Northern armies outnumbered their enemies and were better equipped. Still, the South won many of the battles. President Lincoln was constantly disappointed in the great Army of the Potomac's generals and doubted their will to fight. Then, in July 1863, the war turned around. After a 48-day siege, Ulysses S. Grant's Union troops took Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. At the same time, Lee was badly beaten at the Battle of Gettysburg. General George Meade probably could have destroyed Lee's army by pursuing the rebels from Gettysburg, but he stayed behind and licked his wounds. At this point in the war, the morale of Southern soldiers was low.
While everyone knows that the Confederacy is on its last legs, still our boys fight as desperate as ever. It makes me feel sad to hear the old soldiers talk about the hopelessness of the cause. While there was hope for our independence at some future day, life was held lightly in comparison to the cause. Now, it seems like life is being thrown away as it will accomplish nothing.
Following his success at Vicksburg, Grant marched his army east to aid the Union Army of the Cumberland, which had been mauled at the Battle of Chickamauga and besieged at Chattanooga. Lincoln, again disappointed by Meade, liked Grant's fighting spirit and brought him east to coordinate the actions of the Army of the Potomac. William T. Sherman assumed command in the West and took Atlanta in September 1864. Sherman then asked to cut his supply lines and live off of the land as he marched his army southeast to the sea. By doing this, he planned to divide the South in two and break the Southern people's will to support the war. With great reluctance, Grant agreed. Sherman departed Atlanta with an army of 58,000 men. The troops left a swath of destruction 60 miles wide as they marched 285 miles to Savannah. The city fell on December 22, 1864. Sherman offered the fort to Lincoln as a Christmas present, then turned his army north to march through the state that had incited the war.
The whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak havoc on South Carolina. I almost tremble at her fate, but I feel that she deserves all that seems to be in store for her.
Sherman's army entered South Carolina on February 1, 1865, and bludgeoned her as they went. On the 17th, they captured Columbia, the state capital. That same day, Confederate troops evacuated Charleston, deserting the place where the war had begun. In the meantime, the war was raging in eastern North Carolina. Since late in 1863, Wilmington had been the South's last open blockade-running port on the Atlantic coast. Most of the supplies for Lee's Southern Army came through the city's docks and over the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. The federal government knew that Wilmington must be captured to stop the supplies. Two forts defended the city. Both were situated south of the port, one on each side of the Cape Fear River. Fort Fisher was a huge earthwork installation, extending a mile along the seashore. In late December 1864, Union forces tried to take the fort but failed. They returned 2 weeks later with the largest Army-Navy collaboration of the war. Fort Fisher finally fell on January 15, 1865. On the western riverbank, Fort Anderson was taken on February 19th. Days later, Union troops occupied Wilmington. Federal forces in eastern North Carolina continued inland. Near Kinston, they fought the Battle of Wise Fork and prompted the Confederates to scuttle their ironclad riverboat, the CSS Noose. The Union victory opened another source of support and supply for Sherman. The first troops of Sherman's gigantic army entered North Carolina on March 1st near Monroe, but Goldsboro was their objective. That town was at the intersection of two railroads, and it was the best place to resupply and reinforce the troops. the Great Army moved through the state in 2 columns.
Johnston County, North Carolina, March 1865. My dear mother, I once more have the pleasure of writing you a few lines from which you will find by reading that I am well and hearty, truly hoping that those few lines may reach you in due time and find you all enjoying the same good blessing of God. This is the first opportunity that I've had to write you since we left the coast, and we've been fighting ever since we left, off and on.
Robert E. Lee placed Joseph E. Johnston in command of Southern forces in North Carolina and assigned Johnston the task of stopping Sherman's advance. Johnston assembled a hodgepodge of an army of fewer than 30,000 men near Smithfield. His best hope of achieving his objective was to isolate and destroy one of Sherman's columns. On March 15th, units from the 2 armies clashed a few miles south of the town of Averysboro. Heavy fighting raged until noon the next day. The Confederates held their positions, but under the cover of darkness, they withdrew that night. From prisoners captured at Averysboro, Johnston learned that Sherman was headed to Goldsboro. Consequently, he deployed his troops to the small village of Bentonville and waited for the enemy. Sunday, March 19, 1865, was a bright, sunny day. Sherman's left wing moved toward Bentonville. Despite increasing resistance by Confederate cavalry, the advancing Federals were unaware that Johnston's army laid in wait. At 10 a.m., the rebel cavalry withdrew, revealing the main Confederate line. Initial Union attacks against this line were easily repulsed. At 2:45 p.m., the Confederates launched a massive assault, which routed one Union division, isolated another, and captured Federal artillery. Union reinforcements arrived and blunted the rebel attacks, and by dusk the Confederates had withdrawn to their original positions.
The battlefield was a horrible sight to behold. The dead and wounded was so thick, our men drive them until dark and after. Getting our dead and wounded off the field, our men fell back to their old line of battle.
Monday saw less actual fighting. Skirmishing was heavy, however, as both armies maneuvered to gain a tactical advantage. Both armies held their positions, but Federal reinforcements continued to arrive. Sherman turned his right wing towards the battlefield. It was raining when dawn broke on Tuesday, March 21st. Soon, Sherman's entire army was on the field, leaving Southerners outnumbered nearly 3-1. Scattered, sporadic fighting took place all day until about 4 p.m., when a division of Federals commanded by General Joseph Mower made a daring charge to within 200 yards of Johnston's only path of retreat, the bridge over Mill Creek. Johnston redeployed his forces and successfully defended the bridge, but the enemy before him was too large. With more than 2,600 men lost, the Confederates' position was tenuous, and their lines grew weaker by the minute. The beaten rebels withdrew from the battlefield that night. The bloodiest battle ever fought on North Carolina soil was over. After a 9-month siege, Ulysses Grant forced Robert E. Lee's army out of Petersburg, Virginia, and then hounded Lee's retreat. Their armies fought for the last time on April 6th at Sailor's Creek. Lee finally surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse. April 14th was the 4th anniversary of the fall of Fort Sumter. The retired Major Robert Anderson returned to ceremoniously raise the United States flag over the garrison. That night, a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. On April 26th, the two adversaries at Bentonville met peacefully at James Bennett's home near Durham Station, North Carolina. General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered the forces under his command to General William T. Sherman. It was the largest troop surrender of the entire war. The Civil War was finally over.